The Possessed Toy. Hello friends, welcome to the horror ghost stories. The story begins. In a small, dusty antique shop tucked away on a forgotten street, a lone, faded toy sat in the corner. It was an old, wooden doll, its face chipped and eyes almost too lifelike, glinting as if watching. Sarah, a young woman with a passion for rare collectibles, stumbled upon it one afternoon while browsing the shop. Despite its eerie appearance, she couldn't resist the pull of its mystery. The shopkeeper, an old man with a crooked smile, warned her about the doll's unsettling history, but Sarah, skeptical and intrigued, purchased it. That night, she placed the doll on a shelf in her living room, a decision she would soon regret. As the clock ticked past midnight, Sarah noticed strange noises coming from the living room. It sounded like soft tapping at first, but it quickly escalated into scraping, as if something was dragging across the floor. She tried to ignore it, convincing herself it was just the house settling. But then she heard a faint giggle, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Her heart raced as she slowly crept towards the living room. The doll was no longer where she had left it. Panic surged through her, but before she could react, the door slammed shut behind her, trapping her inside the room. The lights flickered and dimmed, casting shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally along the walls. The doll reappeared in front of her, now standing on its own 2 feet. Its eyes locked onto hers, its grin widening impossibly. Frozen in place, Sarah felt a cold gust of wind whip through the room, despite all the windows being closed. The doll took a slow, deliberate step toward her. The air grew thick, heavy with dread, and her breath caught in her throat as she heard its voice low and raspy, as if it had been waiting for her to come. "Play with me," it whispered, its voice sending chills down her spine. Desperately, Sarah tried to escape, but the room felt like it was shrinking around her. The doll continued to move toward her, each step bringing it closer, its once innocent appearance now contorted in an expression of malice. The wall seemed to close in, and she felt an invisible force push her back, preventing her from reaching the door. In a panic, Sarah reached for a nearby lamp, smashing it against the doll, hoping to break its hold on her. But the doll only tilted its head, unfazed, its grin widening even further as the room became darker, colder, and more oppressive. Sarah screamed, her voice echoing through the small space as she tried to push past the doll, but it grabbed her arm with a grip like iron. Time seemed to lose all meaning as Sarah struggled in vain. The doll, now standing impossibly tall and grotesque, dragged her toward the corner of the room, where shadows swallowed her whole. In the darkness, the only sound was the doll's eerie, melodic giggle, slowly fading into the silence. The next morning, the sun rose as it always did, casting light through the dusty windows of the shop. The toy was back in its corner, sitting innocently, waiting for its next victim. Sarah was gone, her disappearance unnoticed by the world outside. The shopkeeper, with his knowing smile, simply dusted off the toy once again, ready to sell it to the next unsuspecting soul who would wander into his shop. The cycle would continue. The shop was a peculiar place, a relic of another time, filled with forgotten treasures that seemed to have their own stories. The air inside was thick with the scent of old wood, dust, and the mustiness of age. Shelves were packed with oddities, tarnished silverware, faded paintings, and clocks that no longer ticked. But the doll, the one that had caught Sarah's eye, was the shopkeeper's most prized possession. It sat in the farthest corner, tucked between some old wooden crates and glass figurines. Its porcelain face, chipped and cracked in places, seemed to smile even when no one was looking. Its eyes, dull and lifeless when examined in daylight, were a different matter when the sun sank, the glass reflecting an unnatural gleam. The shopkeeper had warned Sarah about the doll, but she hadn't paid him any mind. He had told her, with a slight tremor in his voice, that it had been in his family for generations. He spoke in hushed tones, as if the very mention of its dark past might summon something. But Sarah, caught up in the allure of owning something rare, dismissed the old man's warnings, thinking he was just adding to the doll's mystique to increase its value. Once home, she felt a strange unease settle in her chest, but again, she shrugged it off. It was just a doll, nothing more than an antique with a bit of charm. She placed it on a shelf near the window, where the sunlight would fall on its face during the day. The first night, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. She went to bed as usual, the distant hum of city life outside her window lulling her into a deep sleep. But the silence of the house was broken by the scratching sound in the dead of night. It was faint at first, just a subtle noise that could have been the wind, or the house settling. Sarah had grown used to these sounds in the old, creaky house she lived in. But then the scratching turned into scraping, as though something hard was being dragged across the floor. Her pulse quickened. She sat up in bed, straining to listen. The sound grew louder, now accompanied by soft thudding footsteps. The thud, thud, thud of something small walking. Confused, she stood and crept out of bed, her feet silent on the cold hardwood floors. She reached the living room doorway and froze. There, just inside the threshold, was the doll. It stood upright, facing her, as if it had been waiting. Its glass eyes glinted in the faint light from the hallway, and the edges of its painted lips curled upward into a grotesque imitation of a smile. Sarah's heart raced, her breath caught in her throat. She had been sure she had placed it on the shelf. She had even turned its head slightly, so it faced outward. But now, its gaze was locked on her. The air felt thick and suffocating, the shadows in the corners of the room seemingly deeper, more menacing. She reached out a hand to steady herself against the doorframe, trying to convince herself it was just her imagination, or maybe some kind of trick her mind was playing on her in the dark. But then came the voice. It wasn't loud, but it was clear, sharp and shrill. It sounded as if it came from the very walls of the room. "Play with me," the doll whispered, its lips barely moving. The hair on the back of Sarah's neck stood up. Her legs felt weak, as if they no longer belonged to her. She had heard of haunted objects before, but she had never believed in them. Now, her skepticism shattered like glass under the weight of the doll's presence. "Who are you?" she whispered back, barely able to find her voice. The doll did not answer in words, but its eyes glowed. They weren't just reflecting the dim light, they were absorbing it, growing darker, deeper. The room seemed to contract around her, the walls stretching inward, pressing against her chest. The air was thick with the scent of rot, and the silence was deafening, except for the doll's unsettling giggle, a low, unnatural sound that reverberated in her ears. Desperate to break free, Sarah turned toward the door, her hand reaching for the doorknob. But before she could even touch it, the door slammed shut with a force that shook the house. The sound was like thunder. Panic surged in her veins. She pulled at the knob with all her strength, but it wouldn't budge. The wall seemed to close in, the room shrinking around her. The doll had moved closer. She turned around to face it, her pulse hammering in her throat. The doll was no longer just standing, it had stepped down from the shelf, its tiny wooden feet making faint tapping sounds on the floor. It was walking toward her, each step slow and deliberate, its arms outstretched like it was reaching for her. Its once innocent expression had transformed into something much darker, its mouth opening wider as though it were about to devour her. The room seemed to stretch and warp as the shadows reached out, pulling the doll closer to her. "Play with me forever," the doll crooned, its voice now a harsh rasp, as though centuries of evil had bled into its tiny frame. With a cry of terror, Sarah backed away, stumbling over furniture in a desperate attempt to escape. Her hands grasped at the walls, but they felt slick and cold. She tried to run toward the window, but before she could make it, the doll lunged, its tiny hands gripping her arm with a strength that seemed far beyond its size. Its porcelain fingers dug into her skin like claws. The room plunged into complete darkness as the lights flickered and died. The doll's laughter echoed through the empty house, growing louder and more distorted. Sarah fought to break free, but the doll's grip was unyielding, pulling her toward the corner of the room. The shadows there seemed to swirl and grow thicker, consuming her, swallowing her whole. In those final moments, Sarah's mind raced. She could barely breathe, the weight of the darkness pressing in from every side. The doll had her now, and there was no escaping its grasp. The last thing she heard was the high-pitched sound of its laugh, followed by an eerie silence. When the morning sun rose, the house was still. No sign of Sarah remained. Her disappearance was as sudden as it was mysterious, leaving only the doll behind, standing innocently on its shelf. It was waiting for its next victim. Weeks later, the doll found its way back into the shop, where the shopkeeper dusted it off, ready to sell it again. He had seen this pattern before, one that repeated for generations. He never questioned the doll's power. He simply made sure to keep the warnings to a whisper, knowing full well that it would eventually find another curious soul to claim. The cycle of horror would continue, and the doll would wait, ever patient, in the corner of the antique shop, its eyes always watching. As the days passed in Sarah's home, no one seemed to notice her absence. Her neighbors, her friends, her family all carried on with their lives, unaware of the darkness that had taken hold of her. Her phone was left unanswered, her belongings remained untouched. The house, once filled with the warmth of her laughter and the hum of everyday life, now stood cold and silent. The curtains in her living room fluttered ever so slightly in the wind, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. But one thing remained, the doll. No one knew how long it had been since Sarah vanished, but to those who walked by the antique shop, it had become something of a local mystery. The shop seemed to attract the curious, and its dark reputation had grown with each passing year. Whispers began to spread about the strange happenings in the building. People who had dared to step inside often felt an unsettling presence, the overwhelming sense that they were being watched by unseen eyes. But the shopkeeper never seemed to mind. He simply smiled and made sure that the toy stayed well positioned in the corner, ready to ensnare the next unsuspecting soul. The doll had an insidious way of luring people in. It wasn't just its unsettling gaze or the twisted grin that made it stand out. It was something deeper, something hidden beneath its painted face. It was as if the doll could sense the vulnerability in a person, their loneliness or longing, and it fed on that. Like a predator waiting patiently for the right moment to strike, it knew when to appear on the shelf of the shop, when to be noticed. One day, a young couple entered the shop, drawn in by the peculiarities of the place. They were searching for something unique for their home, something that would add character and mystery to their collection of antique items. The woman, Alice, had an eye for strange, old things. Her husband, Thomas, had a curiosity for the supernatural, even though he didn't fully believe in it. When Alice laid eyes on the doll, she was immediately taken by its unsettling beauty. "It's so eerie," "Don't you think?" she said with a shiver in her voice, stepping closer to the doll. "Yes," Thomas agreed, feeling an inexplicable unease creeping up his spine. "But it has character. It's like it's waiting for something." The shopkeeper, overhearing their conversation, stepped forward with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "It has a very interesting history. Some would say it's more than just an antique. It's been in my family for years. A strange thing, that doll. It's best to be careful around it." Alice laughed lightly, assuming the man was simply trying to add to the allure of the doll. "Don't worry, we're used to oddities. We'll take it," she said, reaching out to touch the doll's wooden hand. The moment her fingers brushed against its smooth surface, she felt a sharp jolt run through her arm. It was as though the doll had transferred a strange, electric energy directly into her body. Alice jerked her hand back, startled, but she dismissed the feeling as nothing more than a trick of the mind. She was already too intrigued to let go of the doll now. She turned to Thomas, her eyes alight with excitement. "This will look perfect in the living room. Don't you think?" Thomas hesitated, his instinct telling him to walk away. But Alice's enthusiasm was infectious, and he was already imagining how the doll would fit into their home. The shopkeeper's warning lingered in the back of his mind, but they had already made their decision. The doll was theirs. That night, the doll made its way to their home, its porcelain face reflecting the light of their hallway lamps as it sat on a shelf in the corner of their living room. It looked harmless enough in the daylight, surrounded by books and candles, its eyes dull and lifeless once more. But when the darkness fell, the atmosphere in the room shifted. As Alice and Thomas settled into bed, the house was eerily quiet, save for the distant hum of the city and the occasional creak of the floorboards. But then, in the dead of night, they heard it. The faint scratching sound, just like Sarah had. At first, they thought it was an animal, perhaps a rodent moving around in the walls. But as the noise grew louder, more insistent, Thomas's curiosity began to turn into something darker. He got up to investigate, his steps cautious as he made his way down the hall. The scratching intensified, now accompanied by soft thumping sounds. His heart pounded in his chest as he reached the living room door. The room was dimly lit by the faint glow of the street lamp outside. The air felt colder than it should have been. He stepped inside, and there it was, the doll, standing in the center of the room. Thomas froze. It was impossible. The doll had been on the shelf only hours ago. Now it was standing, its wooden feet planted firmly on the floor. Its eyes were no longer dull. They were glowing, dark and alive, reflecting the dim light like two bottomless pools. Its grin had widened, its mouth stretching unnaturally. "Play with me," it whispered, the words clear and sharp in the silence of the room. Thomas's blood ran cold. He stumbled backward, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The doll's gaze followed him, its smile growing wider with each step he took. He tried to move, to run, but his feet felt frozen to the floor, as if the room itself was holding him captive. The walls seemed to stretch, distorting as though the very fabric of reality was being torn apart. The shadows in the room deepened, and Thomas felt as if they were closing in on him, swallowing him whole. The air grew thick, almost suffocating. He tried to shout for Alice, but his voice caught in his throat. Alice, meanwhile, was trapped in her own nightmare. She awoke to the sound of Thomas's voice, distant and muffled as though he were calling from somewhere far away. Her skin prickled with the sensation of being watched, and when she looked toward the living room, she saw a flicker of movement in the corner of her eye. She rushed toward the door, but when she opened it, the living room was empty. There was no sign of Thomas, only the doll, standing perfectly still on its shelf once again, its eyes gleaming in the dark. Panic gripped Alice as she turned, but the shadows seemed to stretch out after her, chasing her through the house. It was as though the very walls were alive, pulsing with a malevolent energy. The doll was here alive, waiting, and it would never let them go. Days later, Alice's family would come searching for her, but all they found was the house empty, silent, and the doll, still on its shelf, gleaming in the dim light. The shopkeeper, once again, would dust off the doll, ready for the next unsuspecting soul to fall into its trap. And so, the cycle continued, an endless loop of terror, stretching across generations. The doll waited patiently, its eyes never blinking, for the next lost soul to take its place in the growing darkness. The end.